Hello YouTube, my name is Masso, and I am going to record a rant for you today. I recorded this about 6 times last night, but decided not to use any of those recordings because I was basically playing Mount&Blade while recording them, and I kept getting distracted by the game. So instead, I'm going to record and play the game separately so that you can just watch something while I talk about this. But this is essentially a debate that it's not been raging or anything like that, but it is existed for quite a while, but has come to light more recently on the internet with the rise of the HEMA community and everything like that becoming a lot more of a mainstay in the internet's subcultures and things like that, them getting bigger YouTube channels, historical documentation becoming more important to us and things like that. And people have started to apply history to fantasy, which I actually love, because I felt that fantasy in general was lacking in a lot of that department, and that things like Dungeons and Dragons were built around something that just plain didn't make sense sometimes. So, what am I discussing today? Well, I'm discussing weapons terminology. Weapons terminology has been a conversation that comes up. Almost every YouTube personality in HEMA and things like that have weighed up on it and have given their 2 cents. And most of the time they tend to just explain, I find at least, if they're from the HEMA community, they tend to explain why HEMA uses the terms it uses and why they should use those terms. And I might be swimming against the flow here, because even though I do, I'm trying my best to get into HEMA, and right now I'm just kind of on a hiatus because of financial issues, but trying to get back into HEMA as soon as possible. My personal issue with it is just that, in general, they tend to take things out of context just the same way that they are telling the fantasy writers that they take things out of context. So what do I mean by that? Well, the simple fact of the matter is right now we have kind of like 3 prevailing terminologies for weapons that I've heard out of people's mouths when we're discussing various weapons from medieval times. Probably the pinnacle of this, like crux of this conversation and debate, is found in the one-handed medieval sword, the cruciform, one-handed cutting and thrusting kind of sword that you would typically see knights in the Crusades carrying, and also people later on carrying as a sidearm when pole arms and other things come into play a bit more, and heavy armor and so forth. And essentially there's 3 kind of camps on what to call various weapons, but this is probably the weapon that defines these camps the most, because it's a different name in every camp, and they mean different things, and they're used for different reasons. So in the historical camp, they call this an arming sword, just sword, or occasionally I have heard it called a cut and thrust sword or a knight sword. I wouldn't recommend those last 2, though, because they also take things out of context sometimes and try to apply things from certain areas. Like, knights weren't the only ones who used it, so that's a dumb name if you ask me. And calling it the cut and thrust sword kind of takes out of the side sword's separation from it. So either way, the point is that the 2 main ones I've heard, at least, is just calling it sword or calling it an arming sword. An arming sword is typically referring to it almost as like the way you would refer to a pistol. It's a sidearm. It's a sidearm for something else. Now, sword is probably the most common name for it historically, so it makes sense to just call it the sword or the one-handed sword. However, we have different choices in video games and in theater. In video games, fantasy games, and things like that, it's very common... Sorry. It's very common, especially in fantasy games and so forth, and in D&D, to use the Dungeons and Dragons terminology, which is essentially to call that a longsword. And they don't call it a longsword because it's long in comparison to most swords. They call it a longsword because it's long in comparison to short swords. Now, that's the context for why they call it a longsword in those fantasy RPGs. I can definitely see why that pisses historical reenactors and swordsmen and things like that off, because short swords are not the most typical type of sword you're going to see. Usually the one-handed sword is the most typical type, like, length of sword you're going to see worldwide, so it seems ridiculous to call that the longsword when there are longer swords than it. But that is the reason D&D set that up, because they were trying to set apart the differences between a gladius, an arming sword, and a long sword, and possibly even a great sword. Although I would say that Dungeons & Dragons doesn't seem to understand what a great sword is. But, yeah, they're trying to set those different things apart. They want to set apart the two-handed swords, the longer swords, and things like that. So they name the long sword the bastard sword, the great sword still the great sword. They call the arming sword the long sword, and then they call the gladius the short sword. And all of that is pretty crazy. I don't really see why it can't just be short sword, sword, long sword, great sword, or something like that, but I digress. So that's D&D's take on the subject. When we get into theater, some people might be wondering, why is he bringing theater into this? Because this is also a term I see used very, very often, and I think its main bridging point comes from theater and stunt work, which is they call it the broadsword, which isn't necessarily incorrect, because the context for calling it the broadsword is that it is far broader than a rapier, which is the other long, one-handed, dedicated one-handed sword that can be commonly used. The reason that some reenactors and historical people don't like calling it that is because the cruciform sword, with only a crossguard and not a basket hilt or a swept hilt, that wasn't used that much among rapiers. Only in very early stages of the rapier were those still used commonly. And it's more common to use the basket hilt broadsword, and so they typically call a basket hilted one-handed sword a broadsword, and it gets confusing from there. The other thing is it the broadest type of sword you'll encounter? No, like some forms of Viking swords can look broader than an arming sword, and it all depends also on what era and stage and what typology you use for the arming sword. So now that we have that kind of squared away, though, the point is that theatrical broadsword exists because rapiers also exist in their scope of context. And that's why a lot of people use it still nowadays, is because it's still a broad sword to them. It still looks very broad in comparison to something like a rapier or sometimes even a katana or something. So the context does hold true there. But which one should you use? That's the question, right? If you're writing a story, if you're making a game, if you are playing tabletop, or just trying to figure out what weapon terminology you should use in your day-to-day life, which should you use? Well, I would say for day-to-day life, the HEMA weapon names are the most accurate because they're meant to try to capture what people would have called them at the time of their use. So I would say use those names if you can, which you can. But if you're making a game or creating your own fantasy setting or your own book or something, I would say that you shouldn't take a page from Dungeons & Dragons, but you also shouldn't necessarily just take a page from YouTube channels. We've been discussing context this whole time, and context is what is the most important in this given moment, in this given sphere and topic, I would say. So, what should you call your one-handed sword? That depends on what else people use in your setting. If I'm going to tell you to take a page from any content creator when it comes to weapons terminology, I would say one of your best bets would be Mark Smiley of the Artesia and Sword and Barrow and the Barrow and so forth. His world is called the Known World, and it's an interesting kind of, not historical fantasy per se, but historically inspired fantasy and mythologically inspired fantasy rather than just your typical runoff fantasy where it's inspired by other fantasies that other fantasy writers have written. But yeah, it seems to be a directly inspired from the sources kind of thing, and a kind of a rebuilding. And in his universe, he has cruciform, cut and thrust, one-handed swords. He has rapiers, arguably early stage rapiers. Some might even go so far to call his rapiers in the Barrow, for instance, side swords, because he does mention they're for cut and thrust as well. And he also has long swords, essentially, which are two-handed, but not so large that they should be considered great swords kind of swords. Great swords do exist in his world as well, but they are separate from the longsword. However, he doesn't use any of the names that I just used except for rapier. He uses rapier to describe his thrust-centric one-handed swords, But besides that, he uses different terms. Now, the great sword does continue to be called the great sword, although sometimes he does just refer to it as the two-handed sword, which is a very good way to reference it. If he used it as basically like calling it almost like a pole arm, that would be pretty neat too. But the context of the situation, great sword and two-handed sword, still works perfectly as well. But what about longsword and one-handed swords? Does he call them sword, arming sword? Does he call them long swords and things like that? Well, no. He differentiates by actually broadswords can just be called swords, but he calls them broadswords. And he calls them broadswords because rapiers are also present in the setting too. So the context of his choice makes perfect sense. The characters would call them broadswords, so there's no reason to not call them broadswords. As for his longswords, he uses an alternative, but still relevant and still authentic historical term for them, which is the sword of war. And that's very important, and I think is a good distinction to put on them, because the sword of war became a term that was used later on, also around the time when more rapiers started coming in, because you no longer would carry the long sword in your day-to-day life. Now, there probably wasn't many stages where people did carry longswords in their day-to-day life. They would have definitely carried them if they were knights, maybe, or if they were noblemen. I know that Fiore and many of the manuals that we use nowadays in HEMA do mention using longswords for self-defense, so that does suggest people did carry them, but they didn't carry them that often. Even so, when rapiers and one-handed swords kind of came back into fashion because of that, longswords started to get waylaid to just being used for war. So he uses the term swords of war, which I actually think is very appropriate and a very good choice to use. He doesn't call them war swords. It's always swords of war, which is a very important distinction as well. So, yeah, I would say take a page from Mark Smiley. Make it about the context of the given universe. Don't make it about the context of a given preference or of the modern day. If your world doesn't take place in the modern day, there's no reason to use our modern, historically inspired terms for it. But if you are trying to just kind of get an overall bridge, or if you're just trying to create a weapons list that doesn't necessarily come up with the weapons terminology of the in-game characters, you can call it technically whatever you want, but so long as it makes sense within the context of the game. So in that way, I guess I'm kind of going against what most HEMA enthusiasts say, where although it is nice to indulge in these historical terms, and if you're definitely writing something set in history, and it's in medieval times, do not call it the broadsword or the longsword if it's a one-handed sword. It is neither of those things historically. However, if you are indeed making a world that has a specific given timeline or certain context for a weapon, it makes sense to call it such. If you have messers and falchions in your setting, sometimes there's a lot of spillover between those. But if you want to make a distinction, for instance, you can make a distinction by calling the thicker ones falchions and the thinner ones messers. That's an easy distinction to make. So make distinctions, but make them make sense to the characters and the people living in that world. Something that people would actually say, not something that sounds incredibly technical or specific or special. Just do something that sounds like a normal word. So that's my insight on it. It doesn't really give you a distinct thing to choose from, but I would say do check out historical terms and things like that, and HEMA knows what it's doing for the most part, like the general feel of it, but don't use it as the pure Bible that you can't, go against. There is no heresy when it comes to weapons terminology, but do try to make the context make sense. If there are swords longer than your one-handed sword currently being used in your world, do not call it the long sword, because that doesn't even make sense in the context of your world. My name is Massa Perez. I just gave you a semi-informed opinion from a channel called Idiot Olympics. Let's see how well that works out. Cheers.